So people have to make a living. I made wine goblets for years because they'd sell. But it was funny because I made a switch at some point in the process of making wine goblets. I went from making clear or lightly colored wine goblets to melting silver on a dark glass. And suddenly, actually, I kind of got woken up one day by somebody I met at the post office in Shelburne. This guy said, hey, well, actually, these wine goblets they were dark. You couldn't really see light through them, but you could see patterns of the silver melted in them. And to me, they were reminiscent of what now look like Hubble Space Telescope photos. And I met a guy who was getting his mail, and he said, hey man, that was just incredible last night. We were drinking out of your wine goblets, and then suddenly we weren't drinking out of your goblets at all. We were drinking out of the sky. I just thought, oh my God, how much had he been drinking? But in fact, it made me realize that something as elemental as a wine goblet could become something utilitarian and elemental as a wine goblet could become something much, much more. Mm-hmm. And so I began to make things with the intent, and partly because of the influence of the sky, walking between house and studio, I began to make things that were really space related, which suddenly worked into a childhood of reading science fiction and a whole collection of books that I'd amassed on Landsat photos, and the fact that I later learned to be a pilot and I love scuba diving because you're in this little world, or you're in the cockpit of an airplane, and you can explore the universe, and wherever you want to go, you just follow that river all the way up to the Canadian border, or you fly out toward the ocean, or you can explore a reef and get up close to something. It's sort of a microcosm or a macro. But I began to be able to explore that in my work, and I think sometimes when I'm most successful, my work does evoke a sense that you're looking at something not glass. Mm. The Rhinebeck Craft Fair show changed everything. When I first took orders, I had left Vermont. I was moving to my grandfather's house in Connecticut, but I didn't have a studio, and I didn't have any money to build a studio. But I took orders at this craft show, and I literally took about $5,000 worth of orders, which was more money than I'd ever dreamed of making. And I had I went to a bank in Connecticut to borrow money to try to build a studio on my grandfather's property. And I don't know, the bank in Connecticut, they said, well, do you have any collateral? And I said, well, I don't have any collateral. I own a truck, but I do, if I have orders, and if I make these orders, I'll get the money. And they said, we'd like to, so they looked at these orders, and they just, because they were not even printed on stationery. Right. But they lent me $5,000, and I paid them back, and I built a studio, and wow. That was the beginning of it. So art was not in my plan. I just loved making glass. It was an incredible challenge to do this, but I was more concerned with, making something that I could sell to pay the bills to just keep on going. And while at my grandfather's house, at least, so if you roll around to 1974 to 75, I was selling wine goblets that I was learning really how to make, sure. But I was selling them for relatively little money, $3 to $6 each, and it just wasn't enough money to survive. I was barely making it, and I was working, I tried working from 6 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning every day because it was cooler in the summer, and but it was just really nip and tuck. And if I weren't living I was paying rent to my grandfather, but if I'd been out in the real world, it wouldn't have worked. And I finally decided that I didn't want to make goblets anymore. I wanted to stop making them, and the only way I could think of stopping was to raise the price so radically that people wouldn't buy them. And so I raised the price from $3 to $6 a piece to minimum of $25 a piece, and which meant that they would be resold by galleries at $50 each, and I thought that would do the trick. The plan totally backfired. I took at least 5 times as many orders for the expensive goblets than I did for the less expensive goblets. But at $25 a piece, I was totally willing to work all day and all night, and amassed enough money in a year to purchase this property. I'm with a mortgage. And so I made wine goblets along with other objects but I couldn't really concentrate on the other objects because wine goblets sort of there was such bread and butter and they did so well. Until one day in 1987, I just said, I'm not doing them anymore. And that's when I was able to really begin to work on, I'd already started experimenting with silver and doing different shapes. And as a kid, I'd always loved and I raised guppies. Isn't that a goofy thing, But I was just a little kid, but I'd spend hours staring into a fish tank while I was supposed to be doing homework or reading or something, and just imagining this little microcosm of fish that never saw beyond the edge of that glass wall. And I think in some ways that affected sort of what I do in glass, where I just love the fact that you can have an entire universe inside a glass sphere or inside the walls of a vase. Wow. Moving here in 1976 was just a whole new thing. I purchased this house for $57,000, and it was a beautiful farmhouse, but I intended to live here for a long time. I had a studio in Vermont, then a studio in Connecticut, and once I moved here, I thought, I'm going to try to stay here as long as possible. And inevitably, there were no other craftspeople around save, one leather craftsperson who lived in Shelburne Falls, and so I made contact with him. Ironically, the people who sold me this house, he was a blacksmith. He had actually been an American history teacher at Northfield Mount Hermon School, but had decided to give that up to become a blacksmith and learn how to do that. And so he'd built a forge here on the farm, and but he moved away. So there were really essentially just 2 craftspeople in Shelburne Falls. There's so much other benefits to being here, like the fact that you can plant a garden and have trees and flowers, and for me particularly important, a beautiful night sky, unpolluted by light, because we're pretty far away from any urban area.
Sure.
With glass furnaces, especially back then, I built all my own equipment. I built all the burners for my equipment, and I didn't have any automated equipment at all. So in order to turn the temperature of a furnace up, I had to increase the pressure of the gas and then alter the amount of air that was going in and get that mix right. And then there was nothing that would stop it at a certain temperature. And so oftentimes I would have to adjust a furnace 2 or 3 times in a night, or at least once every night. So I got used to and accustomed to waking up between midnight and 4 or 5 a.m. and walking out to the studio just to make sure everything was okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, glass furnaces are a little bit like farm animals in that regard. And along the way, I began to just revel at the night sky.
Sure.
Sometimes I'd just be sleepy and barely able to stumble out there, but more often than not, there would be just wonderful stuff going on. Thunderstorms coming up the valley, or an aurora borealis occasionally. And I've got some amazing photos of those things. In fact, after moving here, I began to meet people relatively quickly. And one way that happened was, well, one neighbor drove in the driveway and wanted to say hello to the guy who'd paid the most money for a farm ever sold. And then he noticed that I had 2 Labrador retrievers. And I said, yeah, that's Tasha, and that one's Ibu. And he said, if they chase my sheep, I'm going to shoot them. That same day that my sheep neighbor came to visit, a teacher came in the driveway and just asked what I did and welcomed me to the neighborhood. And I showed her the glass studio, and she asked if I would do a demonstration for all the 8th graders in Franklin County, and which I did. That ended up sort of, in order to think of something to make for them, I ended up making planets, little spheres, little marbles. Over the years, more and more craftspeople have moved in. Actually, several of my neighbors moved here because I said, this is a great place to live. You should come here. And I knew they were having to move, or were looking for someplace, or were looking for space. And the fact that culturally, the university, which used to be pretty insular in just the Amherst area, really, as the university grew, and there are actually more than the University of Massachusetts. There's Smith College, Hampshire College, Mount Holyoke, Amherst College, yeah. And so there are a lot of educators, and there's a lot of cultural stuff going on. And suddenly Western Massachusetts became sort of the hotbed of liberal, pinko, commie, left-wing, hippie, whatever. Actually, one of the things that happened in the first year that I was here, I had one other friend here, Jane Sinauer, was a potter up in this area, who I knew her and her husband before I moved to this area. And actually, we stayed at their house when we were doing our investigation to try to find a place to live. And Jane was kind of one of my oldest friends, Jane and Andy, and we would go eat Chinese food in Amherst. That was the big exotic food to eat at the time in the 70s. And Jane kept saying how she was kind of sick of being a production potter, but that she wanted to do something with education for kids. And we talked about this for a couple of years before she eventually started something called Horizons School, which became later on Snow Farm. And so Snow Farm became kind of a cultural center because over the years, even though it started as a summer program, you really can't have a 50-acre property with 4 dormitories, a commercial kitchen, an administration building, and classrooms, and expect it to survive just on a summer program. So Snow Farm started having weekend workshops and week-long or 2-week-long intensive workshops. They even got involved with the Elder Hostel program. I kind of like to call them hostel elders. And it turned into a marvelous school. It's been going on for 35 years. And when Jane retired, I ended up helping the school was going to go out of business, and there were 2 significant investors. I put a little bit of money into the school, but I ended up being a part owner of this, a fractional owner of Snow Farm. But in 2008, when the economy went to hell, my 2 partners went bankrupt. And the bank came after me so I ended up owning Snow Farm. So the other thing that Jane and Mike Cohen and Mike Cohen's wife, they started something called the Asparagus Valley Potters Guild. And I joined the guild even though as a glassblower, we all agreed that we had enough commonality in the fact that, well, potters use glaze, glass is glaze, kind of just more of it.
Yep.
And so, and for years, I'm still a member of Asparagus Valley Potters Guild 40 years later. And actually, there's a meeting tonight, which I can't make. But for years, we met and had potluck Sunday dinners once a month, and would talk about everything from galleries to other artists in the area to other media to cultural events that are going on to sharing. There is not a meeting that goes by when somebody doesn't bring a glaze that has crazed, or there's something wrong, or they're having problems with. Actually, at the last meeting, Kona F4 feldspar used to be mined in North Carolina. Well, the mine is played out, and
Spruce pine.
Yeah, spruce pine, North Carolina, exactly. And for some unknown reason, I bought a whole pallet of that stuff before it went out of business, and so I have this giant skid, probably more than I'm going to be able to use during my mortal days. And there are several potters at Asparagus Valley Potters Guild who really need or have glazes that work with Kona F4 that's not available anymore, and so I've been sharing this feldspar.
Sure. Gotta have the flux, man.
And so yeah, there is that community of, I mean, if we were just neighbors, we'd be going over and borrowing Grey Poupon or salt or eggs. And but it is nice to know that there is technical help. I think probably the most important thing that I think I can take some credit for is that over the last 40 years, I've had a string of apprentices who worked with me for oftentimes for years. Some people for 10 or 12 years or longer, who've gone on to build their own glass studios. Chris Constantine and Kathy Young, Jonathan Winfisky, Ralph Mossman, Ed Branson, Wes Fleming, Bob Dane, Dan Clayman, Dan Sherlock, Jay Brown, Katie Brown, you know, on and on and on. Right. But these people, like Jonathan Winfisky, went on to teach Jordana Corson, because Jordana was his apprentice, and then Jordana later became an educator at Franklin Pierce College, and Jordana has like this string of people, including Jay Brown, who works for me now. Jay was taught by Jordana, and so Jay was able to walk into my studio and understand everything, because his teacher was taught by Jonathan, who was taught.
And so there's this connectivity.
And it's amazing that there's this community of, and a couple of years ago there was a show of all the people we could find who had worked with me, and the city of Westfield sponsored a show of Josh Simpson, not clones, people who had worked with me. I think the one thing, if I taught anybody anything, it was, this is cool, this is a Bic pen. Bic pens are all alike, and so are all our glass tools, but how you sign your name is unique, and you should revel in the fact that you are an artist yourself, and you should differentiate yourself from everyone else. You shouldn't make work that's derivative. And I would say, absolutely, every one of these people, even Katie Brown, who is probably New Zealand's most well-known glassblower at this point, all of them have a unique style that is not derivative of the work that I do.
Yeah.
And I should also say that there's this really great camaraderie of the people that have worked with me over the years. And, you know, I'm sure somebody hates me for some reason or other, deservedly. But basically, all of us really get along, and we still have this little community of Josh Simpson graduates, and which is very nice. And I think another thing that I added to that group of people is the fact that nobody just blue glass. We all swept the floor and we all packed packages and tried to call accounts who owed us money, and we all learned chemistry together, and so it's a strong but wider community. I mean, it goes literally all the way to Australia and New Zealand, and at least in the glass community, historically, there's been this aura of secrecy. But if you tell me what your technique is, the unwritten deal is that, great, now Josh knows that, but I'm never going to do it. I'm never going to take that away from you.
Yeah.
I will never do that. And there's that ethic. I mean, I may try to find perhaps a different way to incorporate that knowledge, but it's a marvelous kind of feeling where you can trust people to share techniques that 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or I don't know, it might have been secret. I'm really jazzed about doing this show mostly because the work that I'm showing was started by them by throwing a piece of sand into a grimy oyster, and now 30 years later.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll have to go find a copy of my book, because the original plate that I made with Fuller money is pictured in that book from 19.
Oh wow!
And
I'd love to see it.
yeah, I'll have to go get it.
Awesome.